we're done with today's lecture, I'll also go in and put a um, link to the recorded video so you can get to it through our Canvas page as well. So we're done with today's lecture. I'll also go in and we can mute that though. Okay. So let's then. All right, so here we go. So again, our job for today is to kind of describe and define what psychology is, what it is as a study, and what it's not as a study. Look at some of the goals of what we try to do when we're studying behavior or mental processes. And then we'll maybe, if we have time, we'll get into some of the different philosophies and camps of psychology, different areas of thought that kind of define what it is, where our current knowledge, as you would say, um, from that perspective. Okay. But let's go ahead and start with a definition of psychology. And of course, if you've been in many courses and whatnot, the terminology just means the study of. So we're kind of wondering, what is the study? What is psych or psycho? Okay, psych comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning mind. Okay, but it actually has a much deeper meaning than the word mind, because what it literally translates in Greek is the word breath. Okay, because what the Greeks believed is that when we took our first breath, when we were born, we breathed in our soul or our mind. And then with our last breath, we breathed out our soul and our mind. Okay. And this, if you want to think about, so originally we were called the study of the mind. What is it that constructs our world? What gives us experience? What determines how we behave and interact with other people and with ourselves? Okay. And so in the original definition of psychology, psychology was the study of the mind. Okay. Um, in a more modern term that we'll use, and I mentioned this yesterday, the modern term that we'll use as a working definition for this class is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Okay. And so I just want to break some of this down just a little bit. What do we mean by scientific? Okay. Within the field of psychology, it means that we use a method and an analysis that helps us study some problem or understand some psychological, mental, or behavioral process that then can be replicated by another psychologist. They can then take our study, they could put it under the scrutiny of a different sample or population and see if that findings that that first psychologist got is something that can be replicated and can be uh, validated through continued replication. Okay. If you want to kind of think about this in the guise of why do so many scientists believe in global warming, it's because the findings of the original scientific studies have been replicated for the majority of the studies of replication. So once you get above about a 75% replication rate, you're pretty scientifically confident in the findings. So that's kind of an example. Now, I will mention that in the last couple of decades, psychology has been in kind of what's called the replication crisis. Okay. If you all would have taken this class, let's say 25, 30 years ago, we would have talked about a whole bunch of studies on thought processes, on social behavior, on emotions and whatnot. And we would have went over all these studies and really kind of to try and explain some different processes. But over the last 25 years, there's been what's called the replication revolution, where a lot of those original studies have been replicated and they don't replicate, okay? And they don't validate. In fact, again, going back before 25 years, about 60% of the studies that we used to talk about in psychology, you really won't even find in a textbook anymore because we have found that those results were not replicated, okay? And so one of the things you will find in this class is that everything we talk about are things that have gone through the scientific process and have gained evidence based on the fact that the results have been replicated, okay? So it's a scientific study, and it's a scientific study of behavior, which, as you note down here, behavior is those things that are overt. They're things that we can directly observe, such as someone crying, someone's reaction time. When we look at, for example, studies in the brain, and we're using imaging techniques, we can physically observe those behaviors of the brain through the imaging techniques, okay? That's different than mental processes. Mental processes are those things that are covert. They're the things that I, as the researcher, do not have direct access to. So I have to go through you to understand what you're experiencing. So for an example, if uh, if we were talking about something like pain, and I asked, how much pain do you feel right now? And we put it on a scale of 0 to 10. There's no real objective measure of that mental process. What I can do is have the subjective experience of that by asking you, as the person who is experiencing it, the amount of pain you are feeling, okay? And we'll see a lot of mental processes, for example, when we get to things like memory, when we get to things like learning processes, definitely when we talk about motivation and mental processes, of course, I mean emotional processes. These are all things that are covert, that I don't have direct observation of as the researcher, okay? Um, and then the last part of psychology is that there is a movement within in the field to maybe what we should be considered is the study of the brain, because a lot more psychology has been focusing on different brain processes that are associated with a given behavior or mental process. And indeed, when I did my dissertation was on a social process. It was about identity and loneliness. But even within that, I had to write a chapter on the associated brain processes that occur when you're thinking about your identity as a human being or when you're experiencing loneliness. And so there is a large movement within the field that suggests that maybe what we should do instead of being called the study of the mind or behavior and mental processes, maybe the study of the brain, okay? And we will talk a lot about brain processes as we move through this class and associated brain areas, because it kind of highlights some of the different our different understanding of what different processes are. Okay, um, and we'll get to those as we move along. But there is that argument, but I don't think we're quite there yet, as you will see as we move along. Okay. The other thing that I do want to mention is psychology is both a profession, a science, and a profession. There are psychologists who purely do research. I'm thinking mostly, for example, cognitive psychologists who study decision making and those kinds of things, experimental psychologists who just do pure experimentation on some topic within the field. Other examples are developmental psychologists, partly social psychologists. All of them do pretty much pure research and work within the field of science. On the profession end, this is when we apply our scientific knowledge of psychology to some human problem. Okay, probably the most popular and is, for example, clinical psychologists or counseling psychologists who use what we've learned about human behavior to help someone with a mental illness or a mental health issue. Okay. But there's also other psychologists, such as industrial organizational psychologists, who apply what we know about human behavior and mental processes in the workplace to improve efficiency, leadership, those types of things. There's human factor psychologists who study the interaction between humans and technology. And so there's others that are within the profession that we try to improve the human condition. But as we will see, sometimes psychologists can use what we know for nefarious reasons and not so good reasons, as we'll get into here in a little bit. Okay. So that's our definition. Again, the main one that we're working on for this class is we're going to use this working definition. Okay. And that's something to kind of keep in mind as we move along. Okay. So then the questions are, so given that our study is of human behavior and mental processes, what is the goals? What are we really trying to achieve when we're looking at some psychological phenomenon? Okay. And as we will begin, we always begin with description. Okay. And this is being able to name or classify various observable, measurable behaviors. Okay. So I'm going to kind of use a clinical example to kind of flow through this, because I think it's something that is relatable within our world. Is, let's say we're psychologists and we're noticing that there's people who are coming to us with very, very, very similar symptoms. So let's say they're very unmotivated. They have very little motivation. They have a really blah mood, kind of a melancholy, just don't feel like smiling much. They're having sleep disturbances. Maybe they're sleeping too much. They're not sleeping enough. Maybe they're also having some eating disturbances. Maybe they're overeating or undereating, but they also have all these clusters of these other behaviors. They have very little interest in their work or their family life. Okay. And we look at that and we see that there's people with these clusters of behavior that is different from other people that we see. Okay. And so the description is those behaviors, and maybe what we do in the description phase is label it. So let's say in this case, we would label this as depression, right? I'll just put DEP. Okay. So we've provided a description and a label for it. Okay. Now what we want to do is understand it. Okay. So we want to understand and be able to state what are the causes of the behavior. So we're going to look at, for example, things like genetics and inheritance. How much can be contributed to nature, which is our genetics, or nurture, which is our life experiences? Is there situations within a person's world that can start the depressive process or trigger the depressive process? Is there certain populations, men, women, or non-binary, that seem to have it more or less? Is there ethnicity? What about cultures? Is there cultures that seem to have this cluster of behaviors that we define as depression. So we want to understand the potential causes of it. And then after that, we want to predict it. We want to forecast it accurately, okay? Now, admittingly, this is kind of one of the areas of psychology, because we're a young science, that we do have difficulties really predicting well. And a good example of this is depression, because while there is a high inheritance quotient, meaning that depression tends to pass down from family member to family member, there is a subset of the population where there is no inheritance or no genetic predispositions, as you would say, to getting depression. Some people seem to have environmental triggers that start the process. And for some people, depression can just start out of the blue, and just go from one day to the next, and all of a sudden they're in the depressive cycle. Okay, so this is something that we want to improve on. If I were to say, in most clinical areas and most for most situations dealing with mental illness, this is the one that psychologists struggle with the most, is how do we accurately predict a given behavior. Now, in other areas of psychology, we're pretty good at this prediction. So, for example, we'll look at, for example, the Milgram studies, where we can predict that if we just take a random population, 2/3 of people, if the conditions are right, would shock someone to 450 volts. Okay, and there is no ethnic, gender, age relation to it. It just, there seems to be this 2/3 of population will tend to commit that behavior, where 1/3 will resist doing that behavior. Okay, so in some areas, prediction is pretty good, pretty accurate. Okay, the next thing we want to do, and this is where we can either do good or ill, is we want to control behavior. Okay, so in the area of clinical psychology, what do we want to do? We want people to not feel the depression. We want them to recover from that depressive symptoms. And so we put some type of treatment modality into place that will help the person alleviate those symptoms of depression. So this, if you want to think about control in the clinical counseling area, this is usually a therapeutic process, therapy, medication, all of those kinds of things that we hope can alleviate the experience of depression. Okay. Now, as I have mentioned, sometimes we can use psychological research to not be so ethical. So, for example, during after 9/11, and when we were going into Iraq and whatnot, the authors of the torture books or the interrogation books were two psychologists who said implementing these methods of torture will get the person to omit to some truth about what you're asking them. Okay, completely not correct, but it was one thing that was used to control or to not do such good things. And we'll get into some other examples where ethics really needs to outweigh the use of some of the things that we'll learn in this class. Okay, and then you'll notice this arrow goes back up to description, because once we learn something new in any one of these areas, we have to update our knowledge or our definitions. Okay, and we'll get into that when we get to clinical psychology, and we'll look at different disorders that no longer exist, quote unquote, but that's because we found they were actually just a part of another disorder. And so we'll get into some of those examples as we move along. Okay. All right. So I do want to talk about some misconceptions about psychology and go into some findings too that have again not panned out, but they're still part of popular belief. So probably the most three common myths about psychology is myth number one is psychology is all about mental health and mental illness and abnormality. Okay. And while this myth really kind of comes out of because some of the popular people within the psychology, such as Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and a few others, Carl Rogers, were clinical counseling psychologists, psychiatrists. And the other part of it is if you look at the American Psychological Association, about 53% of their members are clinical and counseling psychologists. So it's understandable where this myth comes from, but the field, as you will see in this class, is much more broad than just about mental illness and mental health. Do each field within psychology want to promote healthy mental health? Yes, but we're not all counseling therapists, as it would say, okay? Myth number two is that psychology is not a science. Um, and this is a misconception in that the official field of psychology is very much a science. Okay. But there are a lot of people out there, especially on the internet and in the social media worlds, that claim that they're psychologists, but actually have no actual formal training in the field. Okay. And so this myth kind of comes out because in our popular media, there tends to be this blend of people who call themselves psychologists and trying to promote their motivational books or stuff like that. And those who are actually trained within the field. Okay. And then myth number three, even though this is a fun one to play with, if a psychologist ever says, or even a counselor or a therapist or a social worker says, I can read your mind, they cannot. um, uh, there is this attitude that once you, if you go into the field of psychology or sociology or any of the helping fields, your family members tend to say, keep asking you, are you analyzing me? Are oh, you're trying to figure me out? We really can't do that. Um, Anyone who claims they do, either they're just messing with you, or they're not really a psychologist. We're not mind readers. We make, and even in studies, we make the same errors interpretation of behavior that everybody else does. And I will tell you, I make the same errors in my relationships and in my own mental health and all of those things that everyone else does. But we can't read minds. Okay, so it's kind of keep that in mind. I'm not analyzing any of you. Some other topics are related to myths, and these are some of the things that we don't talk about anymore in textbooks because these are some of the examples of things that have been debunked. Um, and the first one, the one I am going to erase right now is this one, but we'll get through the other ones. One is the idea that opposites attract, that you should get the person that complements the qualities that you don't have, and that's the path to a healthy, strong relationship. Okay. And while that does work for some people, which keeps this kind of myth going, for the majority of people, it's not opposite attracts, but it's actually people in very satisfying and healthy relationships are more similar than they are opposite. Okay. And so it's more similarity that leads to marital happiness, both relationship and sexual satisfaction, and to healthier relationships. And this is kind of the reason why and why we had to change our mind about this. When you get in a relationship with someone that you is not like you, as you would say, is their opposite. So maybe you're laid back and they're very uptight kind of thing, okay, or other way around, okay, because you don't know how they're going to react to you. We spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure that out. Okay. But when we're with someone who is similar to us, we know exactly how they're going to react when we tell them about our day, when we tell them about a tragedy, when we tell them about things that bother us. We know how they're going to react. So we don't have to learn how to respond to the person. Okay. And because we don't have to go through that conflict, we spend more time building our relationship than trying to figure out each other. So that's kind of the current theory behind that. The second one, and this is going to really hurt some of the Jerry Springer fans in the room, lie detectors are accurate. That is very inaccurate. In fact, lie detectors are actually only 49% accurate, meaning that in any given situation, you have a 0.49 chance that the lie detector detected that lie correctly. And so this is something that has been really tested over the last 15 years, and replication and what we call meta-analysis have come out. And we found that lie detectors are only about 49% accurate, a little bit better than guessing whether the person is telling the truth or not. Okay. The third one that I'd like to get to that again is debunked is people only use 10% of their brain. Okay. This myth, I want to relieve all of you. We use all of our brain. Okay. Even when you're asleep, even when you're awake, your entire brain is firing and active. The 10% of the brain thing came from when we're born with about 10% of our brain's capacity. Okay. And this is going to be something that is kind of unique to human beings. Human beings is one of the very, very few species that is born with a physically underdeveloped brain. Okay. Most species are born with a fully developed brain. And as we will see, what does this mean? So the majority of our physical brain will grow between about the age of 0 to 6. So when we hit 6 is when most other species, our brain size is when most other species are being born. Okay. That means that the majority of human brains develop in the social cultural arena of life, not within the biological womb of the mother. Okay. But the myth about the 10% is because we're born with about 10% of our brain's real capacity. But it's a myth because as the rest of the brain grows and physically develops, all of the brain kind of comes online and becomes active. Okay. People often repress traumatic childhood memories. This is a myth because one thing that we have learned is you can't purposely forget something. Okay. Probably one of the most well-known studies in this, and it's a very simple example, is let's say I had you picture a pink elephant. Okay. It can be a stuffed pink elephant. It could be a pink elephant that's jumping around, maybe a baby one going around mom. And I want you to picture whatever pink elephant you have in your mind. Okay. Now I want you to forget about that pink elephant. And if we were in a live class, I would say once you have forgotten that pink elephant, raise your hand. Okay. And yes, there's students who you raise your hand, I've forgotten. And I ask, what did you forget? Well, I forgot that pink elephant. Now you're remembering it again. It's a very simple example. Now, what about young adults who have sudden memories and nightmares and trauma triggers to experiences that did happen in childhood that they have no recollection of? Okay. When we get to the biological section next week, I'm going to explain an emotional memory mechanism within the brain that tries to protect us from trauma. Okay. And that can be turned on and off once the brain feels like the individual is safe or not safe. Okay. So our brain does have a mechanism to repress memories, but it's on an unconscious level. But we can't consciously decide to forget something, if that makes sense. Okay. The next one that has been debunked is students benefit from teachers catering to different learning styles. So the idea that, if you're an auditory learner, you should learn auditorily. When you're a visual learner, you should learn visually. Okay. And we have actually found that this is not true. Okay. In fact, if I were to give you a piece of advice, if you really want to learn something, do it in the learning style that is most uncomfortable for you. So if you are a auditory learner, go in and study material visually. In fact, what I would actually recommend is do it in all the learning styles. Okay. The reason is that when we use the easiest way for us to learn, we don't really work with the information. We don't deeply process it and try to understand it. And so it leaves much easierly, meaning that we don't retain it as well. Okay. Um, this is another good one as we go into college. It's best to stick to your initial intuition on multiple choice questions, meaning that when you go back and you review your quizzes and stuff and you kind of go, well, should I choose C or B on that one? Past research suggested that you should change the answer. Current research suggests that you shouldn't. Okay. And then a last one that is kind of a myth is people who have psychological disorders are more prone to violence. And this simply isn't true. We will get to this very specifically when we get to week 8, but people with psychological disorders are actually less prone to violence. An example is a person with depression doesn't have the motivation to do violence. A person with anxiety is too concerned about their anxious state to think about committing violence. And so we'll get to why this is a myth when we get to week 8, but that is kind of the current state of our understanding right now. Okay. What I'd like to end today's class in, now that we kind of have a description of what psychology is, what psychology isn't, some of the studies that we used to rely on, but we have shown over time don't pan out, is I'd like to spend a minute talking about something called pseudopsychologies. Okay. Pseudo means false, but I want to put a caveat on this. If any of these pseudo methods of understanding behavior and predicting behavior and mental processes work for you, don't, because of this lecture, one, get upset, or two, stop using them. When we talk about pseudo psychologies, we're talking about psychologies that can't be validated with our current scientific methods. Okay, so some of these pseudo psychologies, it may be a method issue, it may be a technology issue that we can't really show that these methods of investigating behavior are valid. I just want to put that out there because there are some people who really feel strongly about some of these pseudo psychologies. Just remember they're called pseudo because they can't be validated with current scientific methods. Just wanted to put that out there. But the reason why I do want to go over some of these is that within each of them, there is some inkling of validation for them, meaning that there is some proof behind some of these. It's just probably not what we think it is. Okay, so the first one that we like to talk about is something called phrenology. Okay. Um, Phrenology was raised out of a time when people were very interested in the brain being the seat of the mind. We just got through two individuals that we'll talk about here in a little while, John Locke and Descartes, to really put the seat of the mind within the brain region. Okay. Um, and one of the things that was proposed within phrenology is if you've ever had a baby or been with a newborn, you will notice that they have a soft spot on the top of their skull. Okay. And what phrenologists believed is that when the baby was being born, that the softness of the skull conformed to the shape of the baby's brain. Okay. And that within each of these regions of brain, there's something called localization of function, meaning that it can predict something about the person. So back in the 1800s and 1900s, if when we didn't have radio or vinyl records or something like that, you would maybe, if you were having a hopping party, you would have a phrenologist come over, and the phrenologist would come over and they would rub your guest's head and tell them, maybe if they had a bump right here, it meant they really liked jazz music. Um, if you if you had some type of indent right here, it might mean that you were good at getting data. You can see there's a volleyball player in here. There's photography and drawing right here. And the idea is that just by doing the shape of the skull, you could figure out the person's personality. Okay. Um, a couple things. One, the soft spot on the top of the skull, the skull actually isn't completely soft. That soft spot is to make it so that the other areas of the skull could fit through the vaginal canal as the baby was being born. So it made it flexible so that the baby could be born. That's the purpose behind the soft spot. But again, so this just rubbing your head and looking and trying to figure things out didn't pan out. But what it does do, so this is that partial truth behind things, is that the brain does have localization of functioning. Okay, so next week when we get to the biology section, we will prove mom was right that she does have eyes in the back of her head, because this back area here is called the occipital lobe, which processes visual information. Okay, we'll find right here, this area right here is your identity area. This, when you're thinking about you and your relationship with other people, this is the area that is turned on. The auditory areas are right here. Your cognitive abilities to solve math problems is somewhere right here. So while phrenology was kind of a hoax kind of idea, it did spark this idea that the brain has some type of localization of functioning, that each area of the brain has a certain purpose. Okay. And so we'll get into that next week on when we talk about biology. Okay. The other one that is myth is what's called palmistry or palm reading. So this is where the individual looks at the lines in your hands, and as this example gives, it can tell you how long you're going to live, what's your fate going to be, or what's the other one? uh, line of the heart, how healthy your heart is going to be in marriage life, and look at the things on your hand and really tell something about you as a human being. Okay. Um, does this method work under current scientific methodologies? No, the lines in your hand really don't predict anything as far as behavior or even mental processes. But again, let's go back to uh, what how did this then become a method of understanding other people? Okay. Palm reading occurred in Western world about 2,500 years ago. Um, and it occurred during a period of time where people were less religious and more naturalists, meaning that they really saw themselves as part of nature, not necessarily part of being a superior being because we were descendants from a god or something like that. And they recognize that the health of a plant can be determined by its markings. So you could tell, for example, how old a tree is by counting the number of rings. You could tell how healthy the tree is by how the leaves are developing and whatnot. And so they believe that because you can look at something in nature and tell its general health by its appearance, you could do that the same thing with humans. And so, why did they choose the hand and why did they choose the palm? Because that's the area of the body that we use the most. We use it to do almost everything in our world and interact with our world. So they felt that it was the hand that was kind of um, the window to the mind. Okay, the hand tell much. The hand can tell how much a person works in labor, those kinds of things. Yes, they can, but it doesn't really tell us much about mental and behavioral processes. However, however, can the physical body tell us something about someone's mental or social well-being? And there is some evidence to suggest yes. One is that most emotions are detected through looking at someone's face. Okay. Another example, the one that comes out of my areas of study, is that when someone is truly, 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 this is some good dating advice for you, okay? If you want to know if someone is really into you and they're falling in love with you, look at the pupils of their eye. Because when you're in love with someone, your pupils don't dilate. Okay. So for dilate, meaning get when the room comes brighter, our pupils become smaller. When the light becomes darker, our pupils get larger. Okay. But when a person is falling in love with someone, the pupils don't dilate. They dilate to what's called the 0.67 mark. Okay, which means that it's a 0.67 millimeters of an opening, and it won't dilate based on the amount of light that's in the room. Okay, so that's just an example of how, yes, we can actually look at certain human behaviors, such as the dilation of the eyes, to tell if someone is really into someone or not. The whiteness of our eyes, the whiter the eye is, the healthier the individual is. The more symmetrical the person's face is, the more less likely the less likely that they'll have some developmental disorder or some psychological disorder of some type. Okay, so while does palm reading really tell us much about a person's behavior and mental processes and health? No, but there are other areas, especially the face, that we can look at and really gain an understanding of a person's psychological or behavioral state. Okay. And then the last, I think this is the last one. The last one that's kind of a good example is astrology. Astrology is that you can really base your day based upon or who you are, your behaviors, based upon the astrological feature in the sky when you were born, the position of the stars when the planet when you were born. Okay, and so I was born in the month of July near the end. And so, according to astrology, I'm a Leo. Okay. Now, why is this considered a pseudopsychology? Okay. It's because of some date issues. Date issues in that the astrological maps were developed over 3,000 years ago. Okay. And in the last 3,000 years, the constellations in the night skies have moved by 6 months. Okay, so in my case, I've been thinking that I'm a Leo all my life, but I'm actually based upon the astrological things that I was born in. Whoops, I'm not actually a Leo. I would have to go 6 months. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I would be a Pisces because that would have been the astrological stars that were there during the time I was born. Okay. So if you want to know your true astrological sign, add 6 months to your current sign. So that's the issue that we have with astrology is it's not actually, you can't really say that I'm a Leo because I was born under the constellations of Leo. I really wasn't. Um, and so this is the issue with astrology currently. Okay. Now, again, I would just want to say if it works for you, don't change it. If it gives meaning to your life, go with it. Because again, it's just that there might not be scientific knowledge of how this actually works. We maybe don't have the technology to detect it. Okay. But is there evidence, again, that based upon the time period you were born, does it predict your outcome? Okay. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest yes. Okay. So, for example, when we look at important figures in history, if they were born at a different point in history, they probably would have not had that much of an effect that they had when they were there. And two good examples is Bill Gates and Martin Luther King. Okay. Many people have looked at, sociologists have looked at, if Martin Luther King was doing what he did back in the 60s right now, would he have that much of an effect? And sociological findings suggest no, not really, that it was important for him to be there in that time period and in that place. Okay. Bill Gates is another example. I don't know how old everyone is in this class. I was just getting out of that. I'm not that too old, but at one point, if you wanted to have time on a computer, you were time limited. At school, you either carried around a little punch card that when you went and put it in the computer at the school, it would do it and a timer would stop. Once the timer went off, you weren't allowed to be on the computer anymore. Then they got to the coins and so on. But at the time, this is the world that Bill Gates was raised in. Okay. And to kind of make a differentiation, Bill Gates was also born into a well-to-do family. And one of the things that there was an issue with is Bill Gates schools really needed a new computer labs. They were very out of date and whatnot. And so Bill Gates' parents said, "We will buy, we'll build or buy the computers that you need for your school, with one condition. Bill Gates doesn't have timed out. He's not timed, okay? Meaning that he has free reign to be on the computers as long as he wanted to, okay? And if you look at the amount of time Bill Gates clocked on a computer between the age of 11 to 18, he actually clocked more hours on a computer than most people graduating with a PhD in computer science at the time. Okay. So Bill Gates, very smart man. Would have he probably done what he did if he didn't have those advantages in that time and place that he was born and raised in? Probably not. Okay. And so there are some examples about time and place with certain individuals, definitely. Um, we can also look, though, at other more broader areas, such as sports. Okay. So, for example, in the field of hockey, most pro hockey players were born in the month of December and January. Okay. We have similar evidence for people who play in pro baseball. Okay. And the question is it because they were born in the cold months? Is it about being born into this time of the year where it's cold and icy and snowy and whatnot? And we actually have found not really. Okay, we actually found it's because around December and January is the cutoff dates for when individuals could enter into the kind of the little league ice hockey leagues, okay? Which means that individuals that were born in those months have as much as 9 to 12 months more experience on the ice rink than individuals not born in those months, okay? So is there something to be said, time and place were born and potential abilities and whatnot? Yes, there are. But again, and this is kind of why, even in the field of psychology, we still want to investigate things like astrology more because there might be something to it. We just don't have the evidence for it right now scientifically. All right, gang, I just noticed that we're heading on 1 o'clock. So where are we heading from there? So we talked about the pseudopsychologies. We talked about some of the myths that we have found due to our research that needed to be debunked and stuff like that. Where are we going to go tomorrow? Tomorrow, we're going to talk about some classical problems in psychology. These are philosophical things that psychology has taken on as part of our investigations in the human mind. Okay, and so we're going to talk about the nature nurture argument. In modern times, this is how much of, for example, your personality is due to genetics versus experience. We're going to talk about the mind body problem. This is your mind separate? Is your mind a separate entity from your body, or are they one and the same? Okay. And then we'll talk about the nature of man, or nature of human beings, we should say. Are we born selfish, violent, angry, as you would say, or are we born altruistic, helping, good? Okay. And we'll see the kind of the arguments. And I will say again that these, while we think they seem to be solved, they're still very, very much up for debate. That we haven't really come to a conclusion on the validity of these. Well, we will talk about one Otham philosophy from one Otham elder about these problems that we've been talking about. And then we'll get into some different theories that kind of lead up to more of what we now consider scientific psychology, and we'll go over some of these different sciences and ideas that we currently use to understand behavior, okay? But I am going to, for the sake of time, stop sharing. Hope that wasn't too